HASSELL is an international practice. We work across the world in a constellation of really amazing cities, from my home city of Sydney to London to all of the great cities of China as well. We do like to challenge ourselves, and one of the ways that we challenge our thinking is around speculation in research and design. So what I'm going to do today is to show you our most recent speculative project. We were inspired by the theme of this conference, which is really that idea of dense vertical urbanism, but also the place that we're meeting as well, so the Pearl River Delta, and in particular, the city of Hong Kong. I think for a lot of urban designers like myself, Hong Kong is really that vanguard city in terms of urban experimentation and innovation. So it certainly is a really great context to be thinking about the future of cities. I think when we think about issues around density, around livability, connectivity, amenity, often we go straight to Hong Kong to think about what some of those answers might be. It has some of the densest urban environments on the planet, but it is really still a highly attractive, highly livable city. It is under a lot of population pressure right now. It's growing quickly, but it has a very limited physical area. So I guess the challenge that we wanted to set ourselves was to say, in that context of such a dense city, is there some way to make it even more dense? How would we do that? I guess we realized we needed to understand what density actually means. We needed to think about what are the elements of a city that support or limit density? What are the new spatial models that we could be thinking about in terms of the way that we design our cities? And importantly, and this is a theme that's been recurring over the last 3 days, we need to look beyond tall buildings. I think that period of saying density is delivered by more floor space and more buildings is past. I think we're really thinking about different things around public space, streets and spaces, around public infrastructure. And so that really is at the core of our thinking as well. So we start with a fairly simple question, I guess, around what density actually is. And I think it's accepted that there's three ways of thinking about density. And I think it's important to think about cities in these three different ways to get that full picture of what density actually means. So clearly there's floor space in buildings. So the ratio of a building's area to its site is a really simple and really conventional way of thinking about what density is. And it's a measure that we probably are using all of the time. The second measure is around the number of dwellings within a particular site or a particular city. This is often related to the floor space density, but not always. It does depend obviously on the size of the dwelling. So you can have a situation, really high floor space density, very low dwelling density because each dwelling is large. I think this is all pretty obvious stuff for everyone. The third and probably the most important measure of density is really around the number of people in a place. And it became quite clear to us quickly that that third dimension of density is the one that's probably the least recognized and most challenging in terms of what the next steps are in terms of density. But obviously, when you look at Hong Kong, by any of those measures, it's a really dense city. FARs of 6, 10, 15 to 1 are pretty common. Dwellings are small, so there's a lot of them. Family sizes are generally quite large. So we have a lot of floor space, a lot of dwellings, and a lot of people squeezed into quite a small footprint. And when you look at Hong Kong compared to a lot of other cities like Sydney, like London, like Paris, the density of the city is miles ahead of any of those places. And this is particularly the case when you think about the structure of the city. About 75% of Hong Kong is undeveloped. It's wilderness, it's nature. And then when you think about the areas that are developed, again, that density just shoots up even higher. So we're talking about hundreds and thousands of people in each and every hectare of the developed part of the city. And that form of the city, or that density pattern, has been the result of a whole range of different factors. So particularly after the Second World War, there was a huge flood of migration from the mainland. In 1 year after the war, the city grew by 50%. A decade later, it was 4 times the size, about 2 million people. And a lot of these new arrivals in the city lived in quite dense, tightly packed settlements, informal settlements on the island and in the lower part of Kowloon. A big change happened in the 50s, quite a devastating event. A large fire ripped through Shek Kip Mei. Around 50,000 people were left homeless, and that led to a new policy around housing in the city, and essentially the rehousing of people in higher density apartments. There were a whole lot of aspirations around the amount of floor space that people could have in these new living environments, around 20 to 25 square meters for each and every person. That certainly wasn't delivered, but what was delivered as part of this policy was an acceptance of high-rise living, which over time became more and more extreme. Some of the other factors later in the 20th century that really reinforced this idea of high-density living, there were two. The high price of land, I guess due to its scarcity, but then also the construction of the metro system, which really consolidated that idea of development and transport being so closely linked, so that private and public investment could yield a great return. So I guess all those things considered, you might think, well, surely that city's dense enough. Maybe we don't really need to do anything. But I guess that really piqued our interest even more. We thought, well, really, this becomes an even more interesting question for us around how we make that city more dense. So returning just back to those three definitions, in a way, the solutions are quite different around those definitions. So obviously, if we're looking to increase the floor space of buildings, we can make taller, thinner, more efficient buildings in terms of floor space. And Hong Kong, as well as many other cities, have been really driving that efficiency within, I guess, the physical infrastructure of the city. Dwellings per hectare tends to be more about the shared urban systems of the city, so around transport, infrastructure, those kinds of things. And again, Hong Kong is a really great example, again, of where you've tied together transportation, movement systems, and density. And so in a way, Hong Kong is really, I guess, addressing those first two definitions of density. We think really the opportunity sits in the third category, that question of how we get more people wanting to live in higher density environments and the kinds of social infrastructure that people need. So open spaces, parks, community facilities, public and private amenity. And often as cities intensify, there's more pressure on those kinds of things. We actually take up land area. We're a little bit meaner about the public domain that we provide for people. But obviously it becomes more important the denser the city becomes. So it really is about that question of how do we deliver the social license for density. We can create more buildings, more efficient buildings, more dwellings, but if people don't want to live in those dwellings, people don't want to live in that city, we've got a real problem. So that then led us, I guess, to define a more defined question for us, which was really this question of can we embrace the idea of density, of height, of verticality, and to think about it as a system of public places. Could we create a vertical street? Is that idea even sensible? And would it in fact support this idea of creating a more dense city? And some of the inspirations we drew from Hong Kong, I think really, I guess, defined what we found was kind of the most interesting answers. These are systems that have been tested in Hong Kong and have been successful, so we thought they were the best starting point. And in particular, I think that concentration of really tall buildings around the peak is a really great and unique system that exists in Hong Kong. So you have that incredible natural system right against the edge of the city, layered movement systems in terms of pedestrian connections. You have the peak tram, which delivers people to the top of that hillside very quickly, but then also a meandering pathway of around 10 kilometers that delivers people to the top of that hillside as well. So we're very interested in saying, what if we took some of those things and applied them to a new, I guess, a new structure or a new type of architecture for the city? And importantly, starting with connectivity and publicness as the most important thing. So the starting point for us was this idea of a continuous ramp. And we chose the idea of a ramp rather than some of the other movement systems that you could think about as the most public, the most accessible, the most flexible kind of circulation path. This was as close to a street as we could imagine in a vertical sense. So some of those other systems like stairs, escalators, lifts, there's I guess, a suggestion of exclusion for some people in society, whether it's a physical exclusion, a social or economic exclusion. So we were really attached to the idea of the ramp. It's also a little bit ridiculous. It's a little playful, and I think that was also a great starting point for what we were talking about. But essentially, it's 10 kilometers long. It rises 500 meters into the air, very similar to the slow path to the peak. The peak is around 500 meters high as well. So I thought it would be an interesting starting point to say, what if we could create this kind of public thing that anyone could access, anyone could use, and they could go right to the top of this system. But because people sometimes are in a bit of a hurry, we thought there needed to be a fast route through this system as well. And instead of thinking about a conventional lift that might stop at each and every floor, we thought about the idea of a tram or a bus that was vertical. So something that would move very quickly through this 500 meters, but it would only stop every 80 to 100 meters. So very similar to a bus running down a street. At each of these stops, we then say we've got the opportunity to create a jungle park, a huge piece of open space, something that's generous, open to the elements, incredibly public as well. And then attached to those things as well, public slabs, hospitals, libraries, market halls, all of those kinds of pieces of social infrastructure that people in the city need. And then attached to those as well, this idea of more active, intense clusters of other uses, retail, workplaces, those kinds of things. And then finally, of course, we're not totally naive. We have to hold this up with something. So our idea was that we would create some kind of structural shroud around this whole system. It would be a little scary to be in a park 400 meters in the sky. So we think this idea of enclosure and containment was an important idea as well. And in a way, if this could become a landscape system as well, it's almost like the armature of a street, the street trees of a street that tie together that system and to give it that sense of unity. So essentially, out of that system, we're now creating all the elements of a main street. We've just turned it vertically. So it has fast movement, slow movement, public space, spaces for social, economic, and ecological functioning as well. And in a way, it's kind of dense. It maybe could get to 10 to 1 or somewhere around there, but in a way, that's not really the point of doing this. We are creating some floor space. We're creating some open space as well. But really, the idea of this system is it's more about what happens around it. So it's about the catalyst of renewal of the surrounding neighborhood. It's about unlocking the potential of a whole neighborhood to change, thousands of new homes, new workplaces, new neighborhoods, and creating what is a complex three-dimensional movement system throughout that whole neighborhood. So it might be faster to live in a tower and connecting to a hospital that is also 40 stories in the air, rather than taking the journey in your lift down to a bus to travel halfway across your neighborhood to a hospital. This would place more things closer to more people and increase density, not only of housing and of workplaces, but density of public infrastructure and public space. And in fact, the more self-reliant and more self-contained this system comes, the better it is in terms of the city. It places less pressure on some of those existing systems of the city. So we think this is a whole new kind of neighborhood. It's a neighborhood in the sky. It's about getting that sense of generosity of open space and openness, the view over the city, but then also moments of intensity. So we think that the expression of the ramp becoming a building, becoming an open space could be a really interesting new kind of architecture for the city. And obviously a really interesting, I guess, brand, an architectural brand for the city. So in a city that is really all about verticality, that's verticality of landscape as well as buildings, these towers could create a whole new image. It's about Hong Kong being that city that really is at the forefront of innovation and experimentation, and the elevation of public good, public benefit above all else was a really important thing. I'm sure some people are thinking superdensity, yeah, kind of sounds super expensive as well. And I think it's a fair point, but it's also a question of public investment and where we put the best public investment. And I'm convinced that investing in public benefit, public space is as important as investing in public transport or even roads and other forms of private transport as well. So what we then did with this was, I guess, a little test of the idea in a part of the city. We looked at a 10-hectare section of Kowloon, encompassing Shekipme, the area which 50 years ago had that devastating event, which really changed the whole course of housing in the city, and thought about what it would mean to add one of these super density elements into this part of the city. It's a little hard to find out what the exact numbers are, but based on standard density of the city, we estimate around 50,000 people would live in this particular part of the city, occupying around 15,000 dwellings. We did an audit of some of the social infrastructure that already exists in that part of the city. There are 4 community facilities: a hall, a church, a library, and a higher education centre, pretty conventional kind of neighbourhood ensemble of public good. But with the introduction of this idea of the superdensity system, there's a whole explosion in that public benefit. So we're seeing 4 new parks, 3 new sporting fields, schools, a cultural building, a hospital, and that in turn allows that full intensification of that neighbourhood. We assume 50% at least in terms of population increase. It could be more, it could be double, it could even be triple. But again, because we're relying less on the existing systems of the city, we're pulling all of that stuff up off the ground plane and making that more complex 3-dimensional system. We feel that that increase in density would actually work in this way. And we think this is just one of many. There could be 40 places in the city where you do this, and this is 1 million, 2 million, possibly 3 million homes for new residents in the city, again, delivered with that public benefit, that public infrastructure as well. Again, we've heard people over the last 3 days talk about the importance of the city, the importance of the ground plane, importance of public places and spaces in the city. And I think a lot of the proposals we've seen have been really incredible and really evocative. But I find a lot of them are about the starting point of a private building, a residential building, an office, a hotel, and the insertion of public benefit, public connectivity into those buildings, which, you know, essentially is a great thing. What we're trying to do with this idea is to really flip that whole equation and say, let's begin with public benefit as the starting point rather than the add-on. So if we create this whole system of public connectivity, of infrastructure, we think about public places first, one that allows that incredible public access all the way to the very top, a real, I guess, a democratic delivery of public benefit. Perhaps that then frames up all of that private development, all of that renewal of the city, and in a way helps to overcome that final hurdle of density, which is really about creating places that people want to live in. So a very, I guess, people-focused approach to the renewal of the city. I'm hoping, William, you might be able to give it a name. I think superdensity probably doesn't capture it. It's almost looking a little bit like an erotic gherkin in itself. So happy to take suggestions. Thank you.